The hardest part wasn't leaving. It was leaving without making a sound. Emma pressed her back against the cold stone wall of the corridor, her fingers gripping the wool of her traveling cloak so tightly her knuckles had gone white beneath the fabric. The candle at the far end of the hall had burned down to almost nothing, and the wax pooled on the iron holder like something melting beyond saving. She understood that feeling precisely. She had 17 minutes, maybe less. The announcement had been read aloud in the great hall at the first bell of evening, and she had been standing close enough to the archway to hear every syllable without being seen. Lord Councillor Drave's voice had carried the way old men's voices always did when they were delivering news they considered favorable, smooth, unhurried, pleased with itself. His Majesty, Alpha King Lucian of the Greyvale Throne, will formalize his engagement to Lady Seraphine of the Ashford line at the next full moon gathering. The union has been sanctioned by the High Council and the Elder Wolves of the Northern Pact. Emma had not moved for a long moment after that. She had simply stood in the shadow of the archway, one hand flat against the cold stone, the other resting, without thinking, against the slight curve of her abdomen. Still so small. Still something only she knew about. Still the most terrifying secret she had ever kept. Then she had walked very calmly back to her room, locked the door, sat on the edge of the bed, and breathed until the shaking stopped. It had taken a while. She was 23 years old. She had spent the last 4 months living inside Greyvale Fortress as Lucian's kept companion, a title that meant something in the shifter courts, something private and acknowledged, and never quite spoken aloud in formal company. She had not asked for a crown. She had not asked for a promise. What she had believed, foolishly, privately, with the particular stupidity of a woman who had allowed herself to feel safe, was that what existed between them was real. That the way he looked at her across a room meant something. That the nights he had spent in her company, talking more than anything, which no one seemed to believe when she thought about it, had built something that could not simply be announced away at the first bell of an evening. She had been wrong. She had also, 3 weeks ago, discovered she was carrying his child. Emma pulled the cloak tighter and moved toward the servants' stairs. She had thought carefully about what to take. The small pouch of coin she had saved, a change of linen, the letter from her brother Callum that she kept folded inside her left boot, because it was the one thing in this fortress that belonged entirely to her. She had not packed anything Lucian had given her, not the amber brooch, not the blue wool blanket that smelled like pine resin in him. She left those things on the chair by the window as deliberately as a woman leaving a door open so the smoke could clear. The servants' stairwell was narrow and smelled of tallow and old wood. Emma moved quickly, keeping her steps light, pressing close to the inner wall where the boards were less likely to creak. She was not a shifter. She had no wolf, no enhanced hearing, no scent to read the air the way the guards could. What she had was the kind of attention a woman develops when she grows up in a household where the wrong noise at the wrong time brings consequences. A sharpness, a quietness, a way of making herself very small inside a space. She reached the lower kitchen passage without encountering anyone. The kitchen fires had been banked for the night, and the great iron stoves radiated a dying warmth that smelled of roasted marrow and herbs. A pot of something had been left to cool on the far counter. Rosemary, she thought, and barley, and the ordinary domesticity of it, the sheer simplicity of a pot of soup cooling in an empty kitchen while her entire life disintegrated, made her chest tighten in a way she refused to let become tears. Not here. Not yet. She passed through the side corridor that led to the lower courtyard gate, the one used by deliverymen and laundresses and the occasional traveling merchant. She had walked this route twice in daylight under the pretense of needing air, studying it carefully, noting where the guard rotation paused, how long the torches at the corner gate went unattended between changes. She had done this 3 days ago, when she first began to understand. Not that the announcement was coming, she had not known that specifically, but that something in the fortress had shifted. conversations that stopped when she entered rooms. The way Lord Councillor Drave had looked at her at the last formal dinner, not with hostility, but with the particular blankness of a man who has already made a decision about something and considers it settled. She had begun preparing, quietly, because Emma had learned long before she ever came to Greyvale that preparing quietly was the only real protection available to a woman without a pack, without a wolf, and without the kind of power that made other people careful around her. The lower courtyard gate was unlatched. She had not dared to hope for that, but there it was. She slipped through into the outer yard, where the smell of horses and wet straw and cold air hit her all at once. The sky above the fortress walls was a deep, starless black, thick with cloud cover that pressed down on the mountains like a held breath. Good. No moon meant no shifted wolves running the outer perimeter for pleasure. The formal guard route would hold, and she knew its gaps. Emma crossed the outer yard in the shadow of the wall, reached the postern door cut into the eastern stone, and pushed. It opened with a groan that seemed in her ears, loud enough to wake the entire fortress. She froze, counted to 10, heard nothing, and moved through. The road outside the eastern wall was unpaved and muddy from 3 days of autumn rain. The cold came up through the soles of her boots immediately, and she was aware, with a practicality she clung to, because it kept her from falling apart, that she had perhaps 4 hours of walking before the temperature became genuinely dangerous. She needed to reach the village of Thornset before dawn. There was a woman there, a midwife named Hesta, whose name she had been given weeks ago by one of the kitchen girls who had no idea why Emma was asking, and who had no reason to suspect. She walked. The forest began 50 yards past the road's edge, dense pines whose lowest branches swept the ground and smelled of cold resin and damp bark. Emma kept to the tree line rather than the road itself, where she would be visible. Her breath clouded in front of her face. Her fingers were already cold. She did not let herself think about him yet. She had made a rule about that. There would be time, later, in some room she hadn't found yet, to feel the full weight of what the announcement had meant, what it meant about the past 4 months, about the things he had said, about whether any of it had been real or simply the particular carelessness of a powerful man who had never needed to be careful with anyone. There would be time to be destroyed by that. Not now. Now she walked. She had been moving for perhaps 40 minutes when she heard the horses, not on the road behind her. That would have been the fortress guard, and she would have had no choice but to run. These were coming from the west, from the direction of the lower pass, and there were at least 3 of them by the sound of it, moving fast. Too fast for a merchant party, too quiet for a patrol, which would have carried torches. Emma pressed herself against the nearest pine, its bark rough and wet against her cheek, and went absolutely still. The riders came around the bend in the road at a pace that suggested urgency rather than routine, and in the near darkness she could make out the shapes of cloaks and the pale breath of horses. One of the riders pulled slightly ahead of the others, and even in the darkness, even at this distance, even with every rational part of her insisting that this was coincidence, that it was impossible, that he could not have known, she recognized the way he sat a horse, upright, still, like something that had never needed to grip anything to stay in place. Emma did not move. She did not breathe. She pressed her face against the cold pine bark and prayed, with a fervor she hadn't felt since childhood, that the dark was thick enough and her stillness complete enough, and the wind carrying her scent away rather than toward him. Lucian's horse slowed as it came level with the tree line. He stopped. The other riders drew up behind him. She could hear one of them speaking in a low voice. A question, she thought, though the words were lost in the sound of wind through the pines. Lucian did not answer. He simply sat there in the dark, facing the tree line, and the silence stretched out like something alive. Then he turned his horse back toward the fortress without a word, and the 3 of them rode away. Emma stayed pressed against the pine for a long time after the sound of hooves faded. Then she straightened, adjusted the cloak, checked that Callum's letter was still in her boot, and kept walking. Thornset was smaller than she had imagined. Emma reached the outskirts of the village as the sky began its slow, reluctant shift from black to a bruised, uncertain gray. Her feet were wet through her boots, and the cold had worked its way past the wool of her cloak and settled into her shoulders like something permanent. The village was a handful of stone buildings clustered around a central well, with a farrier's shop at one end and what appeared to be a small inn at the other, its sign hanging crooked from a single iron hook. Smoke rose from 2 chimneys. A dog barked once somewhere behind a fence, and then went silent. She found Hesta's cottage by following the description the kitchen girl had given her. 3rd house past the well, blue door, dried bundles of something hanging from the lintel. The bundles were there, lavender and something else, darker and more astringent, that Emma couldn't name. She knocked twice, quietly, and waited. The woman who opened the door was older than Emma had expected, with white hair pinned back severely, and eyes that moved over Emma with the particular efficiency of someone accustomed to assessing emergencies. She took in the mud on the boots, the traveling cloak, the hour, and the carefully controlled expression of a young woman who had been holding herself together through sheer discipline for several hours. She stepped back and opened the door wider without saying anything. The cottage was warm. That was the first thing Emma registered. Genuinely, deeply warm, from a fire that had clearly been burning through the night, and the warmth hit her so suddenly after the cold that her eyes stung. She blinked it back. She would not cry in front of a stranger. She sat in the chair Hesta indicated and accepted the clay cup of something hot that appeared in her hands, and she drank it without asking what it was, because the warmth was more important than the answer. It was chamomile, and something bitter underneath. Valerian, perhaps. A midwife's tea. "How far along?" Hesta said. It wasn't a question. 8 weeks, I think. Perhaps 9. Hesta sat down across from her and looked at her steadily. "And the father?" Emma wrapped both hands around the cup. "Not relevant." The old woman's expression didn't change. "In my experience, when a woman arrives at my door before sunrise looking like she's outrun something, the father is always relevant." "He won't be looking for this," Emma said. "He doesn't know, and I need it to stay that way." A long pause. The fire snapped. Outside, the gray was deepening toward something that might eventually become light. "You're not a shifter," Hesta said. "No." "And he is." Emma said nothing, which was answer enough. Hesta studied her for another moment, then rose and moved to the shelves that covered the entire far wall of the cottage. Clay jars, linen bundles, dried roots hanging in clusters, a row of small dark bottles that caught the firelight. The smell of the place was extraordinary. Layers of herbs and resin and something faintly metallic, the accumulated scent of years of this particular kind of work. "I can't tell you it will be easy," Hesta said, her back to Emma, hands moving along the shelf. "A human woman carrying a shifter child. The pregnancy runs harder. Faster in some ways, more volatile in others. You'll need iron supplements, regular rest, and someone who knows what they're looking for when things shift." Emma absorbed this. "Can you help me?" "I'm already helping you." Hesta turned with a small bundle of dried herbs and a dark bottle. "The question is where you're going after this. You can't stay in Thornset. It's too close to Greyvale territory, and if anyone from the fortress comes through asking questions, a strange young woman with no pack and no name will be noticed." "I know." Emma had thought about this on the road. "I have a brother. In Dunmore, 2 days east. He doesn't know I'm coming, but he'll take me in." Callum, she thought, and the name alone was enough to steady something in her chest. Her brother, 3 years older, who had written her letters every month since she'd left their village at 19, who had never once asked her to explain herself, and had never once stopped asking if she was all right. Hesta set the herbs and bottle on the small table between them. Take the tincture twice daily. The herb bundle goes under your pillow. Don't ask why, just do it. And eat more than you think you need. You're feeding two now, and one of them is going to make demands your body isn't designed for. Emma looked at the items on the table. Something about the practicality of them, the specific, material, manageable reality of a dark bottle and a bundle of dried herbs, made the enormity of her situation briefly bearable. She had something to do. She had a destination. She had her brother's letter in her boot, and a midwife who hadn't asked too many questions, and a child inside her that was, regardless of everything else, still alive, and still hers. She paid Hesta from her small coin pouch, more than was probably necessary, and the woman accepted it without comment. She left Thornset as the first real light broke over the eastern hills, walking east. She did not make it to Dunmore in 2 days. On the second afternoon, crossing a stretch of open road between two dense forest sections, she heard riders again. And these ones were not passing. They were searching. She could tell by the way they spread across the width of the road and moved methodically through the undergrowth on either side, and by the way one of them lifted his head and turned toward her before she'd made a sound. Shifter senses. Of course. She ran. It was not graceful or strategic. It was simply the animal response of a person who has exhausted all other options. And Emma ran into the trees with her cloak tangling around her legs, and her breath coming in hard white clouds, and her heart making enough noise that she was certain every enhanced ear within a mile could hear it. She didn't know who they were. Fortress Guard, Greyvale Scouts, or something else entirely. And she didn't stop to find out. The forest swallowed her. She ducked under a low branch, skidded on a patch of wet leaves, caught herself on a tree trunk and kept moving. The ground sloped downward here, and she followed the slope because going down was faster than going up, and she needed distance more than direction. Somewhere behind her she could hear movement, not panicked, not hurried, which was worse. The controlled movement of something that knew it was faster and was simply closing the gap at its own pace. She broke through a line of undergrowth and found herself at the edge of a shallow ravine, the drop perhaps 10 feet to a rocky streambed below. Behind her, the sound of movement was close enough that she could hear breathing now, and it wasn't hers. Emma did not look back. She went down the ravine the way she'd gone down every difficult thing in her life, without enough preparation and with no real choice, half sliding, half dropping, catching herself twice on protruding roots before landing hard on the rocks below. Pain shot up through her left ankle. Not broken. She tested it immediately, weight-bearing, wincing, but badly turned. She straightened and turned to face whatever was behind her. The man who came over the edge of the ravine was not a Greyvale guard. He was tall, very tall, with dark clothing that showed no insignia, a travel-worn cloak, and the kind of face that had been assembled from harder material than most. He landed at the bottom of the ravine without any apparent difficulty, and straightened to his full height, and Emma, ankle screaming, cloak torn, mud on her hands from the fall, looked at him and said the only thing that came to her. "Don't touch me." The man stopped. He was perhaps 4 feet away from her, and the space between them felt significant. Not threatening, exactly, but charged with a particular quality of attention. He was looking at her with an expression that wasn't surprise and wasn't aggression. It was closer to recognition, which made no sense, because she had never seen him before in her life. "I'm not going to touch you," he said. His voice was low and controlled in a way that suggested it was always low and controlled, not because he was trying to be calming, but because he simply never needed to raise it. "You're bleeding." Emma looked down. There was a gash on her right palm from the roots on the way down, shallow but messy. She pressed it against her cloak. "I'm fine." "You're also limping." "I'm still fine." She kept her eyes on him. "Who are you? Who sent you?" He studied her for a moment. And there was something in the quality of that study, something unhurried and thorough, that reminded her with a specific, brutal accuracy of the man she had spent 4 months trying to understand. She pushed that thought away immediately. "My name is Cale," he said. "I'm the commander of the Iron Veil Border Guard. I wasn't sent by anyone. I'm here because we found a woman's footprints on the East Road 2 miles back, and I wanted to know whether to be concerned." A pause. "I'm concerned." Emma looked at him. He hadn't moved. He hadn't reached for her. He was standing in a rocky streambed in the early dark of an autumn afternoon, looking at her with an expression that was, she realized slowly, simply waiting. "I don't need help," she said. "You need that ankle wrapped in somewhere warm before nightfall. I have somewhere to be." "Dunmore," he said, and then seemed to realize that was a mistake, because her expression sharpened immediately. He held up one hand, palm out. "You were asking about the road in Thornset yesterday morning. The midwife's neighbor mentioned it. I'm not tracking you. I happened to be passing through." Emma said nothing. She was calculating. Ankle damaged, supplies low, 2 hours until dark, unknown man in an empty ravine. Not ideal on any measure. But he hadn't grabbed her when he could have, and he had stopped when she told him to, and his hands were at his sides, and she had learned, over years of reading rooms and conversations, and the particular silences of men who wanted something, that the dangerous ones rarely waited this patiently. "How far is the nearest shelter?" she said finally. Something shifted in his face. Not relief, exactly. More like someone setting down something they'd been holding carefully. "An hour northeast," he said. "There's a borderway station. Fire, roof, water." He paused. "My men are there. 5 of them. They'll leave you alone." Emma looked at her hand, then at her ankle, then at the darkening sky above the ravine. "If anyone touches me," she said, "or asks questions I don't want to answer, I leave. Immediately." "Understood," Cale said. She nodded once, and he turned and began walking, leaving the exact right amount of space between them, enough that she could see him clearly, not so close that she had to think about him. Emma followed, one hand still pressed against her cloak, her ankle aching with every step, and tried to remember that accepting help from a stranger was not the same as trusting him. She was fairly certain she didn't believe that yet. But she walked. The way station was exactly what Cale had promised. A roof, a fire, and 5 men who looked at Emma once and then, after a single glance from their commander, looked away and stayed away. She sat close to the fire with her boot off and her ankle wrapped in clean linen that one of the guards had produced without being asked, and she ate the portion of bread and salted meat that appeared beside her with the same wordless efficiency. The station was a single large room with a low ceiling and stone walls that had absorbed decades of wood smoke, and it smelled of pine resin and damp wool, and the particular closeness of people who had been traveling together long enough to stop noticing each other. The fire was generous. Outside, the wind had picked up and was moving through the trees, with a sound like distant water. Cale sat across the room at the rough wooden table, reading something by candlelight. He had not spoken to her since they arrived except to tell her where the water basin was. She had used it to wash the cut on her palm, which had stopped bleeding and didn't need stitching. And then she had sat down by the fire and eaten and tried to think clearly about what came next. Callum. She needed to reach Callum. She pulled his most recent letter from her boot and unfolded it carefully. The paper worn soft at the creases from the number of times she'd done exactly this. The letter was 3 months old now, written in her brother's cramped, slightly lopsided hand. He'd broken 2 fingers on his right hand as a child, and they'd healed badly, and his writing had always looked like it was leaning into a wind. He'd written about his work at the grain merchants in Dunmore, about the woman he'd been seeing who sold herbs at the market, about a dog he'd found and named Bran, who had apparently eaten an entire wheel of cheese and shown no remorse. He'd asked, at the end, the way he always did, "Are you all right, Em?" "Actually all right," Not the version you tell people. She folded the letter back along its creases and held it in her lap. She was not actually all right. But she was moving, which had always been the version of all right she could manage. "The road to Dunmore," she said, without looking up from the fire. Across the room, she heard Cale set down whatever he was reading. "Is it safe? The full stretch?" A pause. "Mostly. There's a stretch through the Greyvale borderland, about 4 miles of road that technically falls within their territorial claim. It's rarely patrolled this time of year, but it's not nothing." Emma absorbed this. How rarely? "Enough that you'd probably pass through without incident." Another pause, and then carefully, "If you're traveling alone." She looked up at that. He was watching her from across the room with an expression that was neutral in the way that only deliberate effort produces. Not blank. He was too alert for blank, but contained. She had the sense of someone who had learned to take up less space than his actual dimensions suggested. "You're offering to take me to Dunmore," she said. "I'm traveling east anyway. The border garrison at Dunmore is under Ironvale jurisdiction. I have business there." He held her gaze. "It's not charity. The roads are easier with more than one person, and you know it." Emma looked at him for a long moment. He didn't flinch or soften or add anything to fill the silence, which she found unexpectedly reassuring. Men who needed to fill silences were usually hiding something inside them. "All right," she said, "but I'm not explaining myself to you. I haven't asked you to." She turned back to the fire. After a moment, he picked up his reading again, and the room settled into a quiet that was, if not comfortable exactly, at least bearable. She slept better than she had any right to. They reached Dunmore in a day and a half. Cale set a pace that was efficient without being punishing, and he had produced a second horse from somewhere. She didn't ask, which meant Emma's ankle was spared the worst of the walking. The borderland stretch of road proved as quiet as he'd suggested, though Emma spent the entire 4 miles of it with her shoulders up around her ears and her eyes on the tree line. Nothing came. The forest was simply forest, cold, indifferent, smelling of pine and wet stone, and the distant approach of winter. Cale spoke when there was something useful to say and not otherwise. He told her the road conditions, the location of the next water source, the name of a village they passed where the inn was reliable, and the one after where it wasn't. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask where she'd come from or why she'd been running. She was aware, with a wariness she couldn't entirely suppress, that this restraint was either genuine respect or a very sophisticated form of patience, and she couldn't yet tell which. Callum was at the grain merchant's when she arrived. She saw him through the open door of the warehouse before he saw her. Still the same broad shoulders, the same slightly awkward way he held himself when he was concentrating, bent over a ledger with a pencil behind his ear and ink on his left hand. Emma stood in the doorway for a moment and felt something in her chest unlock that she hadn't known was bolted shut. Then he looked up, and his face did something complicated and immediate, and he crossed the warehouse in about 4 strides and pulled her into a hug that was not gentle and was not brief and smelled of sawdust and familiar wool. And Emma pressed her face into her brother's shoulder and allowed herself, finally, to stop holding everything together through sheer force of will. She didn't cry. She was close. But she didn't. "Em," he said against the top of her head. "What happened?" "I'll tell you everything," she said, "but not here." He pulled back and looked at her face, and the thing about Callum was that he had always been able to read her with an accuracy that she'd resented as a child, and was profoundly grateful for now. He took in the mud on her cloak and the wrapped ankle and the controlled expression, and the thing underneath the controlled expression that she was working very hard to keep contained, and he nodded once. "Come home," he said. "I'll make food." She did tell him everything, that evening, sitting at the rough kitchen table in his small, rented house, while rain came down outside, and Bran the disreputable dog slept under the table across her feet. She told him about the 4 months at Greyvale, about what she had believed and why, about the announcement she had heard in the archway, and the night she had walked out through the postern gate and the cold road to Thornset and Hesta, and the tincture she was supposed to take twice daily. She told him about the child. Callum listened to all of it without interrupting, which was a significant act of self-control for him, because his face was doing increasingly alarming things as the story progressed. By the end of it, he was very still in the way that men go still when they are deciding what to do with something large and dangerous that has appeared in front of them. "He doesn't know," she said. It wasn't a question, but she needed to say it aloud. "He doesn't know," Callum agreed. His voice was measured in a way that cost him something. "And I assume you want to keep it that way." "Yes. Emma." He looked at her directly. "You're carrying the Alpha King's child. That's not something that stays quiet indefinitely." "I know that." She had thought about nothing else for the last 3 days. "I just need time. I need to be somewhere safe. And I need to think. And I need—" She stopped, pressed her hands flat on the table. "I need to not be in his territory while I figure out what to do." Callum was quiet for a moment. "Dunmore is on the Iron Vale border," he said slowly. "Technically, it falls under a dual jurisdiction claim. Greyvale doesn't have automatic authority to search here." "I know." She paused. "Cale mentioned that." Her brother's eyes sharpened. "Who is Cale?" "The man who helped me get here. Iron Vale border commander." She met his look. He didn't ask questions. "People who don't ask questions are either very safe or very dangerous," Callum said. "I'm aware." She looked down at her hands. "He's coming to the garrison tomorrow. I thought it might be worth knowing someone with authority here, just in case." Callum studied her for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and covered both her hands with one of his, the way he had done when they were children, and the world was louder than she could manage. "You're not alone in this," he said. "I need you to actually hear that." Emma looked at her brother's face, tired, worried, ink-stained, entirely and completely on her side, and felt the truth of it settle somewhere underneath all the fear. "I hear it," she said. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the shutters and filling the small house with the sound of water on stone. The dog shifted under the table. The fire burned low, and Callum got up to feed it without being asked, moving around his kitchen with a comfortable familiarity that made the room feel like an exhale. Emma sat at the table and took the dark bottle from her cloak pocket and measured out the tincture into a cup of water the way Hesta had shown her. She drank it without making a face, even though it tasted of copper and something intensely bitter, because it was the thing she could do right now. The small, concrete, manageable thing. She was not safe yet. She knew that. Whatever had been set in motion at Greyvale, the announcement, the engagement, the High Council's sanction, moved through the world with a force that didn't pause because she had found a warm room and a brother who loved her. Lucian did not know about the child, but that was a fact with an expiration date, and she was aware of it with the low constant hum of something that hasn't become a crisis yet, but is approaching. And there was something else. Something she had not told Callum, because she had not entirely allowed herself to think it clearly until now. When Lucian had stopped his horse at the tree line on the road outside Greyvale, when he had sat there in the dark facing the pines for that long, charged moment before turning back, she had not heard anything. No command to his men, no order to search, no signal of any kind. He had stopped, and then he had left. She did not know what that meant. She was not sure she could afford to know what it meant. But it sat inside her, small and unresolved, like a splinter she hadn't found the angle to remove. She finished the tincture and rinsed the cup and went to bed in the small spare room that smelled of clean linen and sawdust. She did not dream of Greyvale, She dreamed of nothing at all, which was, under the circumstances, the best possible outcome. The first snow came to Dunmore 3 weeks after Emma arrived. She watched it from the window of Callum's spare room, standing with her palm flat against the cold glass and her tincture cup cooling on the sill beside her. The flakes were small and purposeful, the kind that meant business rather than spectacle, and they settled on the rooftops and the market stalls and the stone edge of the well with a quiet permanence that changed the look of everything. She had always found first snow clarifying. It simplified the world down to what was solid and what wasn't. She was beginning to show. Not obviously. Not to anyone who wasn't looking carefully. But the line of her body had changed in a way she noticed every morning, and Hesta's instructions had proved accurate. The pregnancy was moving faster than she'd expected, with a particular intensity that she suspected had something to do with the child's nature rather than her own. She was tired in ways that went past the bone, and there were mornings when the smell of the tallow candles in her room made her stomach revolt so suddenly she barely had time to react. But she was eating, and she was sleeping, and the tincture was doing whatever Hesta had designed it to do, because the sharper symptoms had begun to level. Cale had come to the garrison as promised and had, in the weeks since, become a quiet and regular presence at the edge of her days. He ate dinner at Callum's table twice a week, conducted his garrison business with an efficiency that apparently impressed even the Dunmore locals, who were temperamentally suspicious of outsiders, and continued his policy of not asking Emma questions she didn't want to answer. He had noticed the pregnancy. She was certain of that, because Cale noticed everything. It was clearly an occupational condition, and had said nothing whatsoever about it, which she respected more than she could comfortably articulate. What she had not anticipated was Callum liking him. Her brother was not an easy man to like quickly. He was warm but slow to trust, loyal but careful about where that loyalty was extended, and he had a particular habit of going quiet around men who reminded him of authority in any form. Cale apparently did not trigger this response. They had discovered a shared and improbable interest in historical border disputes, the kind of conversation that Emma found completely opaque, but that seemed to produce in both men a focused and genuine engagement that she found, despite herself, almost amusing. "You trust him," she said to Callum one evening after Cale had gone. Callum considered this with his usual deliberateness. "I think he's exactly what he presents himself as," he said, "which is rarer than it should be." Emma thought about that for a long time afterward. The trouble arrived on a Tuesday, in the form of 2 men she had never seen before. She was at the market, something she did carefully, hood up, no lingering, picking through the last of the autumn root vegetables with the focused attention of someone who has learned to make a task into armor. She heard them before she saw them, the particular cadence of men asking questions in a way that was designed to sound casual. She didn't turn around. She set down the parsnip she was holding and moved sideways along the stall, with what she hoped was the unhurried pace of a woman who had simply changed her mind about vegetables. They were asking the stallkeeper about a young woman, traveling alone, dark hair, not a shifter. They were from Greyvale. She could tell by the cut of their cloaks, a specific style of collar that the fortress guards favored, and by the fact that one of them had a Greyvale border marker on his belt, the small iron disc that identified territorial officers. Emma walked away from the market at a pace just short of running, and did not stop until she was back inside Callum's house with the door bolted. She sat at the kitchen table and breathed and thought. They were looking for her. Which meant someone had noticed her absence in a way that produced an official search, and that meant the engagement announcement was not simply the end of something, but the beginning of a sequence she hadn't fully mapped. The question was why. Lucian was engaged to Lady Seraphine. Emma was gone. The logical conclusion for a man who had moved on was to let the gone thing stay gone. Unless someone had told him about the child. She pressed both hands flat on the table. Nobody knew except Callum and Hesta, and she trusted both of them completely. But Hesta was in Thornset, which was in Greyvale's territorial borderlands, and if someone had spoken to the midwife's neighbors, Cale himself had mentioned that the neighbor had spoken of Emma's destination, then the trail existed, even if it was faint. She was still sitting there when Callum came home, took one look at her face and said, "What happened?" She told him about the men at the market. He listened with his arms crossed and his expression doing the careful, contained thing it did when he was angry and managing it. "Cale needs to know," he said. "Callum, Emma." His voice was quiet and firm. "This is exactly the situation where having someone with garrison authority matters. If Greyvale officers are operating inside Ironvale border jurisdiction without a formal request, that's a legal violation. Cale can act on that without anyone having to explain why they're looking for you." She looked at her brother for a long moment. The practical truth of what he was saying was undeniable. And there was something else underneath the practicality. A shift in her, slow and reluctant, toward acknowledging that she could not manage this alone indefinitely. "He's going to ask questions," she said. "Then answer the ones you can," Callum said simply. Cale listened to the description of the two men at the market, with his elbows on the table and his hands loosely clasped. And when she finished, he was quiet for a moment that she had learned to recognize as him, thinking rather than hesitating. "I can have them identified and removed from Dunmore jurisdiction by morning," he said. "Greyvale doesn't have a standing search warrant in this territory. Whatever they're doing here is informal, which means it has limits." He looked at her directly. "But if they've been sent, others will follow. Removing 2 men solves today's problem." Emma met his eyes. "Not tomorrow's." "No." Another silence. The fire in Callum's hearth shifted and settled, sending a brief pulse of warmth across the room. "The child," Cale said, and it was the first time he had said it aloud, his voice carrying the word with a careful neutrality. "The father is the reason they're searching." It wasn't quite a question. Emma held his gaze. "Yes," she said. He nodded once, slowly, as if she had confirmed something he had already arranged himself around. "Does he know?" "No. He will eventually. I know that." She kept her voice steady. "I'm not trying to hide forever. I needed time. I needed to be somewhere I could think without—" She stopped, started again. "He chose someone else. Publicly. Formally. With the High Council's sanction. Whatever I was to him, it wasn't enough to change that. And I won't go back to being kept in a fortress while he builds a formal life with another woman. Not with a child involved. Not now." The room was very quiet. Callum was looking at the table. Cale was looking at her. "That's fair," Cale said. Just that. No argument, no qualification, no advice she hadn't asked for. Just, "That's fair." Something in her chest eased, fractionally. "There's a formal mechanism," he continued, his tone shifting to the measured practicality she'd come to associate with him at his most useful. "Under Ironvale law, a woman carrying a child with a legitimate claim to another territory's line can petition for protected status. It doesn't require the father's acknowledgement. It only requires documentation and a garrison commander's endorsement." He paused. "My endorsement." Emma stared at him. "Why would you do that?" Cale looked at her with an expression that was direct without being uncomfortable. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said. "And because I have the authority to do it. And having authority that you don't use when it matters is just decoration." She thought of Lucian saying things she had believed, in rooms that had smelled of pine resin and candle wax, with a certainty that had turned out to be completely misplaced. She thought about the difference between words and actions, between what men said and what they did when the cost of doing it was real. Cale was offering her something concrete. Legal protection. Documentation. The specific, material weight of institutional authority on her side. She almost said no out of habit. "All right," she said instead. The petition was filed the next morning. What happened 3 days later, Emma had not predicted. A rider came to the garrison at dawn, a single rider, moving fast, bearing a seal she recognized with a jolt that went from her stomach to her throat. Not Greyvale. Something older than Greyvale. The Elder Wolf's sigil, a circle of 3 moons above a running wolf, pressed into black wax. Cale brought the letter to Callum's house himself, his expression carrying the particular quality of a man delivering information he hasn't fully processed yet. The letter was addressed to her, by name. Her full name, which she had not given to anyone in Dunmore except Callum. She opened it with hands that she kept deliberately steady. The letter was from Elder Marin of the Northern Pact, a name Emma knew, distantly, as one of the oldest authorities in the shifter world, a woman who had outlived 4 Alpha Kings and sat on no one's council because she didn't need to. The letter was brief. Elder Marin wrote without preamble, in a hand that was old but completely controlled, that she had become aware of Emma's situation, that she had information Emma needed to hear, and that she was currently residing at a monastery 3 days north of Dunmore and would receive Emma at her convenience. "There are things about your child," the letter read, "and about what was done to bring about the engagement announcement that you do not yet know. I believe you deserve to know them before you make any permanent decisions. I also believe that the Alpha King deserves to know what was done in his name without his knowledge." Emma read the letter twice. Then she set it on the table and pressed her fingers against her mouth and stared at the fire. What was done in his name without his knowledge? The engagement announcement. The High Council's sanction. Lord Councillor Drave's smooth, unhurried, pleased voice, reading the words aloud in the great hall. She thought of Lucian stopping his horse at the tree line, sitting there in the dark, not sending his men into the forest, turning back without a word. She thought of a man who had known she was there and had not come after her, and she thought for the first time that there might be more than one explanation for that. "I need to go north," she said. Callum looked at her. Cale looked at her. "Not alone," Callum said immediately. "No," she agreed. "Not alone." The monastery sat at the edge of a granite ridge 3 days north of Dunmore, half buried in pine forest and half emerging from the rock itself, as if it had grown there rather than been built. The stones were dark with age and weather, and the narrow windows caught the winter light and held it in a way that made the building look, from the road below, like something that was quietly watching. Elder Marin received them in a room that smelled of beeswax and old paper, and something herbal that Emma couldn't name, but that made her think of deep roots and long winters. The elder was smaller than Emma had imagined, a slight woman with white hair, and the kind of face that had moved past age into something more absolute, where every line was a fact rather than a complaint. Her eyes were the pale gray of river ice, and moved over Emma with an attention that was neither warm nor cold, but simply complete. Callum and Cale remained in the anteroom without being asked. Emma sat across from Elder Marin at a table bare, except for 2 cups of something dark and fragrant, and waited. "You are further along than you look," the elder said, not unkindly. 12 weeks, Emma said. "Perhaps 13. Marin nodded slowly. "The child is strong. I can feel it from here." She folded her hands on the table. "That is relevant to what I need to tell you, so I mention it first." Emma wrapped both hands around her cup and said nothing. "Lord Councillor Drave has been managing the Alpha King's political affairs for 11 years, Marin began, her voice carrying the unhurried cadence of someone who has arranged facts many times and knows the most efficient order. In that time, he has brokered 7 territorial agreements, 3 succession arrangements, and what he believed was a permanent consolidation of his own influence over the Greyvale throne. Lucian tolerated this because Drave was effective, and because Lucian spent the first years of his reign managing a war in the Eastern Territories that required his full attention. A pause. When that war ended and Lucian began making decisions independently, decisions that Drave had not arranged and could not control, Drave became concerned. Emma looked at the cup between her hands. "Concerned about what?" "About you." Maren met her eyes. Specifically about what you represented. A human woman. No pack, no political alliance, no family name with territorial weight. And yet the Alpha King was spending his evenings in conversation with her, rather than meeting the matches Drave had spent months arranging. Drave is not a stupid man. He read the situation correctly. He simply drew the wrong conclusion from it. The wrong conclusion. Emma felt the phrase land somewhere careful and sharp. He thought Lucian would choose you, she said slowly. And he moved to prevent it. He arranged the engagement announcement without Lucian's knowledge, Maren said, and the words were so quiet and so absolute that Emma needed a moment to reassemble their meaning. Lady Seraphine of the Ashford line is a real woman, with a real family and a real territorial alliance, and the match had been on Drave's preferred list for 2 years. But Lucian had not agreed to it. What Drave presented to the High Council was a document bearing the Alpha King's seal, a seal that Drave had access to through his administrative role, and a set of verbal confirmations from council members he had been cultivating for years. The announcement was read as fait accompli. By the time Lucian heard it, he heard it the same time I did, Emma said. The room was very quiet. Outside, wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing. He came after you that night, Maren said. He rode out himself, without the guard knowing why. He found your trail at the eastern postern and followed it to the tree line. A pause that held weight. He stopped there because he scented something he hadn't expected, and it undid him completely. He didn't come into the forest because he couldn't. Not in the state he was in. A shifted alpha pursuing a frightened woman in the dark is not a reunion. It is a disaster. He had enough control left to understand that. Emma's hands were very still around the cup. She was thinking of the dark road and the cold pine bark against her cheek and the sound of a horse stopping 20 feet away. What did he scent? She said, though she already knew. The child, Maren said simply. His child. The mate bond recognizes its own. The elder looked at her with those pale, absolute eyes. He has been searching for you since that night. Not with guards and warrants. Those 2 men in Dunmore were Drave's doing, not his. Lucian has been searching alone, or nearly so, with the kind of desperation that a man of his control rarely shows and cannot entirely hide from people who know how to look. Emma set down her cup very carefully. Drave, she said. Her voice came out level and cold in a way that surprised her. Has been placed under council arrest, Maren said. 3 days ago. Lady Seraphine's family, to their credit, withdrew immediately when the forgery was exposed. The young woman herself is apparently relieved. The match was not her preference either. A brief pause that might, in another face, have been the edge of dry amusement. The High Council is in considerable disarray. Several members are implicated in accepting Drave's fabricated documentation without verification. There will be a formal reckoning. And Lucian, Emma said. Maren looked at her steadily. Is 2 days south of here. He knows you came north. He is waiting. And this is the part I want you to hear clearly. He is waiting for your permission to approach. He sent word to me asking me to speak with you first because he understood that arriving without warning would be the wrong thing, and because... The elder paused, and her expression carried something that was close to respect. Because he said that if you chose not to see him, he would accept that. He wanted you to know the truth. He did not say the truth entitled him to anything. Emma stood up from the table. She walked to the narrow window and looked out at the pine forest and the granite ridge and the cold white sky pressing down on all of it. Her hands were shaking slightly, which she noticed with a kind of distant detachment, as if observing someone else's hands from a slight remove. 4 months of believing she had been foolish. 3 weeks of running and managing and holding everything together through discipline and practicality, and Callum's solid presence, and the twice-daily tincture, and the letter folded in her boot. The careful architecture of moving forward, which she had built piece by piece specifically because she had accepted, completely and without reservation, that she had been wrong about him. She had been wrong about being wrong. This was, she discovered, not entirely easier. "I need an hour," she said. "Take 2, said Elder Marin. She walked in the monastery's interior garden, which was brown and frostbitten and smelled of cold earth and the ghost of summer herbs, and she thought. Callum found her after 20 minutes and walked beside her without speaking, which was exactly right. After a while, she told him what Marin had said, and he listened, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "What do you want?" he said. Not what should she do, not what made sense strategically. What did she want? Emma stopped walking. The frost-stiffened grass crunched under her boots. She put one hand, without thinking, against the curve of her abdomen and felt the child move. The first time, a flutter so slight she'd almost missed it over the past 2 days, but unmistakable now. Something present and real, and entirely its own. "I want the truth to have been true," she said. "The truth I thought I knew before the announcement. I want that to be what was actually real." "And if it is," Callum said carefully, "then I want to stop running," she said. "I'm very tired of running." Her brother put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him briefly, and then she straightened and went to find Cale. Lucian arrived the following morning. He came alone, no guard, no retinue, on a dark horse she recognized, moving at a pace that was controlled in the way that only cost him something to maintain. She was standing in the monastery's outer courtyard when he rode through the gate, and the moment he saw her, he stopped the horse entirely and simply stayed there, looking at her across the frost-covered stones, and did not move. He looked like a man who had not slept properly in 3 weeks. He looked exactly like himself. He looked at her with an expression she had seen across rooms before, and had told herself repeatedly she was misreading, and understood now that she had not misread it, not even slightly. Emma stood in the courtyard and looked back at him, and did not speak first. He dismounted. He crossed the courtyard toward her, and he stopped at a distance that was respectful, and then, when she didn't step back, closed the remaining space between them slowly, the way you move toward something you are afraid of frightening away. "Emma," he said. His voice was exactly as she remembered it, low, controlled, built for saying things once. "I am sorry for the announcement and what it must have seemed like, and for the night on the road when I stopped and then left. I left because I was in no state to be near you and I knew it, and I have been sorry for it every hour since. I should have found another way." He held her gaze. Drave is facing a full council tribunal. The engagement is dissolved. The falsified documents are in the council record as evidence. A pause. "None of that is why I'm here." "Why are you here?" she said. Her voice was steady. "Because you're my mate," he said. "Because I knew it months before I had the words for it, and I handled it badly. And I let a man I trusted too much operate too close to my life for too long. And because..." He stopped. Something in his composure shifted, fractionally, in a way she suspected very few people had ever seen. "Because there is apparently a child, and I learned about it at a tree line in the dark, and I have been carrying that knowledge alone for 3 weeks, and I would very much like to stop." Emma looked at him for a long time. The courtyard was cold and smelled of frost and pine smoke, and the particular clean sharpness of mountain air. Somewhere behind her, she was aware of Callum in the doorway, keeping his distance with characteristic accuracy. The child moved again, that small, unmistakable flutter, as if registering something. "You hurt me," she said. "Not intentionally, maybe. But the hurt was real. I know. I'm not going back to being kept in a fortress without a title and without a place. Not now. No, he said. That's not what I'm asking. He held her gaze without flinching. I'm asking you to come home as my mate. Recognized, formal, permanent. I'm asking you to let me be present for this. His eyes moved briefly. With a reverence she hadn't expected to break something open in her, to the curve of her abdomen and back to her face. For all of this, Emma breathed. She thought of the announcement in the archway, and the cold road, and Thornset, and Callum's kitchen, and the letter in her boot, and the frost in the monastery garden, and the flutter of a child who was half her and half this man standing in front of her, looking at her like she was the fixed point. Everything else organized itself around. If you ever, she said quietly, handle me badly again, you'll leave, he said, and you'll be right too. He didn't say it to placate her. He said it the way he said everything. Once, clearly, as a fact. She took one step toward him. He didn't move, didn't reach, simply remained, steady, present, exactly where he was. She put her hand against his chest and felt the solid certainty of him under her palm, and something that had been braced for 3 weeks and longer finally, slowly, released. He covered her hand with his. That was all. Just that. They returned to Greyvale 6 days later. Emma, Lucian, Callum, and Cale, who was formally appointed as Dunmore Garrison Commander with Iron Vale Greyvale joint recognition, a posting that suited him exactly, and that he accepted with characteristic brevity. The council tribunal took 3 months. Lord Councillor Drave was stripped of his position, his territorial privileges, and his administrative access, and was exiled to the eastern borderlands under formal censure. 4 council members received lesser sanctions and spent the following year rebuilding trust they had been careless with. Lady Seraphine of the Ashford line sent Emma a letter that was gracious and direct and slightly funny, and the 2 women exchanged correspondence for years afterward. The mating ceremony was held at the winter solstice, small by court standards and exactly right by Emma's. Elder Marin presided, which no one had expected, and everyone agreed afterward was the only appropriate choice. Callum stood beside Emma throughout and cried at the bond ceiling in a way he would firmly deny for the rest of his life. Bran the dog was not in attendance, but received a significant portion of the celebratory roast regardless. Emma's daughter was born in early spring, in a room that smelled of lavender and clean linen, and the first green edge of the season coming through the open window. She was loud and certain, and entirely herself from the first moment, and she had her father's eyes and her mother's expression of mild impatience with anything that wasn't moving fast enough. Lucian held her with the particular stillness of a man encountering something that has permanently rearranged his understanding of his own capacity for feeling. He didn't say anything for a long time. Emma watched him from the bed, exhausted and completely present, and understood that whatever she had believed about this man in the months before the announcement, and whatever she had disbelieved in the weeks after it, the truth was simpler and more durable than either. He was here, and he was staying, and the thing between them had been real from the beginning, and it was more real now. She thought of the tree line in the dark, the stopped horse, the silence before he turned back. He had known, even then. He had just needed her to be safe before he came. That, she decided, was enough. More than enough. It was, in the particular accounting of a woman who had learned to measure things by their weight rather than their appearance, everything. The spring light moved through the window and fell across the 3 of them. The child, the king, and the woman who had walked out of a fortress with a letter in her boot and no plan beyond the next road. And the room was warm and quiet, and fully, finally, at rest. Some stories end with a crown. Some end with a name. This one ended with a window open to the spring. A child who already knew her own mind, a man who had learned the cost of silence, and a woman who had stopped running, not because she had nowhere left to go, but because she had found the one place that was worth staying.